Welcome in, everyone. Today we are stepping into one of the most harrowing, but also undeniably astonishing stories of human resilience in modern history.
Yeah, it really is. It's a story that forces us to look at the absolute darkest capabilities of a state apparatus.
Right.
But at the same time, it shows the completely unbreakable nature of a mother's love.
Exactly. And I want to acknowledge right up front, if you are listening to this and you are completely new to Latin American history, we are going to build the context from the ground up so you won't feel lost at any point.
We'll take it step by step.
Is anchored by a really powerful piece of media we've been reviewing. It's a video transcript produced by the Ayeneh Foundation.
Right, the Ayeneh Foundation.
Yeah.
And they created this video with a very specific, vital mission in mind.
What was that mission exactly?
Well, it is fundamentally an educational endeavor. They recognize that history, especially history involving profound trauma and state violence, it has a tendency to be smoothed over.
Or just completely forgotten.
Exactly, forgotten as decades pass. So their goal is to preserve the memory of those who stood up against this overwhelming darkness.
To make sure people actually know about history.
Right. They put this historical record together so that future generations, which means us and you listening to this right now, can look at these events, understand the actual mechanics of authoritarianism, and learn from the people who fought back.
It's an active tool against forgetting.
Yes.
So what we are going to do today is trace that harrowing timeline. We are looking at a nation's sudden descent into a brutal dictatorship and then the rise of a grassroots resistance.
But the people leading this pushback, they weren't who you might expect.
No, they weren't guerrilla fighters hiding in the mountains.
Right.
They weren't seasoned politicians with huge international backing. They were grandmothers.
Just ordinary women.
Women armed with literally nothing but white cloth tied around their heads and an absolutely unyielding demand for the truth.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
But, to really comprehend the magnitude of what these women accomplished, you have to understand the environment.
The before and the after.
Exactly. You have to grasp the atmosphere that necessitated this resistance. We are talking about Argentina in the 1970s.
So I want you to imagine Buenos Aires in the early 70s. You have this incredibly vibrant, bustling metropolis. The streets are just alive.
The cafes are spilling over with intellectual debate.
Literature, art.
Yeah, and the rhythm of the tango is essentially the heartbeat of the city. It echoes through the nights. It's a place completely defined by its culture and its vibrant political discourse.
It sounds beautiful,
Yeah.
but the contrast is what makes the historical record so deeply jarring.
Right.
That vibrancy was abruptly cut short, swallowed by a chilling silence.
In 1976, that's when a military junta overthrew the government.
And the newly installed generals, they came into power broadcasting very specific justifications to the public, didn't they?
They did. They promised to return to, quote, security. And they explicitly promised the fall of leftism. And, looking at the historical timeline impartially here, just examining the stated goals of the regime, they framed their intervention as a necessary medicine.
A medicine to cure a chaotic society.
Exactly.
But the reality of that security was the immediate imposition of a threatening, suffocating shadow over the entire country.
The music, the debate, the vibrant life of the streets, it was swallowed whole.
The military apparatus didn't just take control of the government buildings. They took control of the daily reality of the citizens.
And that silence, it was the byproduct of a campaign the regime called La Guerra Sucia.
The dirty war.
The dirty war. And the scale of the tragedy that unfolded over the next several years, it's almost incomprehensible from a modern standpoint.
It really is.
The state apparatus orchestrated the kidnapping, torture, and vanishing of nearly 30,000 people.
30,000 human beings.
Yes.
And the defining characteristic of these victims, the only crime that warranted this horrific response, was simply protest or opposition.
They were labor organizers, journalists, or really just ordinary people who expressed any kind of dissent.
But the military didn't just arrest them and put them on trial, right?
No. They utilized a very specific, highly calculated method called forced disappearance.
Let's unpack the mechanics of a forced disappearance for a second, because it is the central trauma of this entire era.
It is. A forced disappearance is fundamentally different from a standard political assassination or an unjust imprisonment.
How so?
Well, it is a state-sponsored crime designed specifically to leave zero evidence. When a state utilizes this method, they aren't just killing a person,
They are erasing them.
or erasing them from the fabric of reality. Individuals were snatched from their homes in the middle of the night, or pulled off the street in broad daylight.
And they simply cease to exist in any official capacity.
Right. There were no arrest records.
No detention logs.
Nothing.
Which means there's no body, no crime scene, and zero closure.
It is essentially a psychological weapon of mass destruction aimed directly at the citizens.
Think about it. If your child is kidnapped by the state and the state completely denies it ever happened, you are trapped.
Trapped in this agonizing perpetual limbo.
You don't know if they're alive and suffering. You don't know if they're dead.
And you don't know if making a public fuss will actually be the thing that gets them killed.
It paralyzes the entire society with this thick, inescapable ambiguity and fear.
And that is the strategic goal of a forced disappearance. It isn't just to eliminate the dissident, it is to infect the victim's family and the entire community with an immobilizing terror.
But the historical record details a layer of this methodology that goes even beyond the vanishing of adults.
Yes, it does.
It reveals what is arguably the darkest, most specific, and most horrific violation of human rights during the entire dictatorship.
The systematic stealing of babies?
This is the part of the history that just stops you in your tracks.
It really does. When the military kidnapped suspected dissidents, many of the women they took were pregnant.
But the regime didn't execute these pregnant women immediately?
No. They actively kept them alive in secret, clandestine detention centers.
They kept them locked in horrific conditions just long enough to reach full term.
The logistics of this are absolutely chilling. These women were allowed to go through the immense physical and emotional trauma of labor and delivery while in captivity.
Often shackled.
Shackled in makeshift maternity wards inside these torture centers. And immediately after the baby was born, the mother was murdered.
She was disappeared.
Yes.
And the newborn infant.
The state completely stripped them of their given identity.
They erased the baby's original name. They forged a completely fake set of birth documents.
And they handed the child over to be raised by a family who supported the military regime.
Sometimes, the child was literally given to the very military officers who had participated in the murder of the biological parents.
It's staggering. And when analyzing the motivation behind this, you really have to look past the sheer cruelty and examine the regime's underlying philosophy.
Right. Why go through the logistical nightmare of maintaining clandestine maternity wards?
Because it wasn't just about physical elimination. This was an advanced, deeply sinister form of psychological and ideological warfare.
The regime viewed dissent almost like a genetic disease.
Exactly. By taking the children of the quote-unquote enemy and reprogramming them within loyalist military families, they believed they were literally cutting off the bloodline of the opposition.
They were attempting to scientifically and sociologically eradicate dissent from the future of Argentina.
It is the ultimate crime against the very concept of identity. You are stealing a human life and completely overwriting their existence.
Turning them into a supporter of the system that murdered their family.
Yes.
When you comprehend that level of calculated evil, you have to wonder how anyone, let alone an ordinary citizen, could possibly fight back.
It seems impossible.
How do you process that kind of loss without completely breaking?
Well, the natural human instinct when faced with a violent, omnipotent state apparatus is to retreat, to hide.
Just to survive.
By 1977, so just a year into the military dictatorship, a small group of women began to find one another.
And these weren't political strategists.
No.
These were mostly grandmothers, women whose pregnant daughters or daughters-in-law had been swallowed by the system.
They started realizing they weren't alone in their specific horrifying grief.
And out of this shared nightmare, they formed what became known as the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo.
And what makes their mobilization so extraordinary is the complete lack of traditional resources at their disposal.
They didn't have an official organization.
No big money, no government support.
And obviously, they were actively being hunted by the government they were trying to petition.
The only tool they really had was a clandestine network of direct communication.
A whisper network.
Exactly. Mothers and grandmothers passing stories, passing names, and fragmented pieces of information to one another, secretly spreading the truth of what was happening across the country.
They relied entirely on the tactics of peaceful, visible defiance, and they created a ritual that would become historic.
They decided to march.
But not a chaotic, loud protest. They began meeting every single Thursday at exactly 3:00 p.m. at the Plaza de Mayo.
Which is the main square in Buenos Aires. It's situated directly in front of the Casa Rosada, the presidential palace.
The symbolism of that location is profound.
They placed themselves quite literally at the doorstep of the power structure that was actively destroying their families.
And their method of protest was uniquely disarming. They marched in complete silence,
They would walk slowly in a circle around the central pyramid in the plaza.
holding up photographs of their missing children and the grandchildren they had never even met.
There is a specific quote from the text that perfectly encapsulates their mission. They stated clearly, "We are not seeking justice, we are seeking our children and the truth."
Let's talk about that distinction for a moment, between justice and truth.
It is a masterclass in civil resistance. In the context of a brutal military dictatorship, the word justice is very easily spun by the state.
Right, they can spin it as a call for political revenge or armed rebellion.
Exactly. By explicitly taking justice off the table and focusing entirely on truth and our children, they completely dismantled the military's standard justifications for using violent force against protesters.
They anchored their presence in an unassailable universal human right.
The primal right of a grandmother to simply know what happened to her grandchild.
To make themselves visible, to recognize each other in these terrifying crowds, they needed a symbol.
And they didn't have uniform budgets. So they turned to the most domestic, accessible item possible.
A white headscarf.
Yes. And the origins of that headscarf are deeply rooted in their cause. Early accounts suggest that the original scarves were actually fashioned from the cloth diapers of their missing grandchildren. Regardless of the exact material, that simple piece of white fabric underwent a profound transformation.
It ceased to be a piece of domestic cloth.
Right. It became a potent, globally recognized symbol of innocence, peace, and unyielding collective memory.
But standing in a plaza with a white headscarf under a military dictatorship is not some poetic, safe endeavor.
Not at all. The state recognized the immense visual and moral threat these women posed.
The cost of this resistance was incredibly high. These grandmothers faced constant, lethal danger.
Police officers would threaten them, they'd use attack dogs.
They were humiliated in the streets, they were routinely arrested and detained.
And the regime didn't stop at just intimidation. They applied their ultimate weapon.
Azucena Villaflor.
Yes, Azucena was one of the original founders and a key organizer of the movement. The military recognized her influence. So in December of 1977, she was kidnapped.
She was taken to a clandestine torture center, murdered, and became one of the disappeared herself, which is the moment where any rational person would say, okay, we have to stop.
Right. They just murdered our founder.
If we go back to the plaza next Thursday, we are going to die.
The fear should have shattered the movement entirely.
Yet, they returned to the plaza the very next week.
The psychological fortitude required for that is just staggering.
There is an insight from the source text that explains this resilience perfectly. Why didn't they stop? Because, quote, they no longer belonged to the disappeared. They belonged to the truth.
When your identity shifts like that, the basic mechanics of fear break down.
They had accepted that their own lives were secondary. They were basically walking ghosts.
But the truth of what the state did to their bloodlines was eternal. They viewed themselves as the living instruments of that truth.
But sheer willpower and visible protest, while morally powerful, presented a massive practical problem.
A deeply bureaucratic hurdle.
Right. As the years ticked by and the regime's grip began to loosen slightly, the question became, how do you actually physically locate a stolen child when the government controls every single piece of paper?
The military had burned the original records.
They had forged birth certificates, stamped by official state doctors.
Placing these children into entirely new families? You can't just cross-reference a filing cabinet when the entire paper trail is a fabricated lie.
The traditional avenues of investigation were totally useless.
And this is where the story takes a massive, unexpected leap into a totally different arena.
The intersection of activism and science.
Exactly. These grandmothers, women who were not scientists, not doctors, not academics, they realized that if the state could forge the paper, they needed to find something the state could not forge.
They needed biology.
They initiated a total paradigm shift in the search for truth. In the 1980s and 90s, these women began actively seeking out geneticists.
They started asking the scientific community a question that hadn't really been posed before.
Can you prove a relationship between a grandmother and a grandchild if the parents are missing and presumed dead?
Think about the audacity of that. You have women in white headscarves knocking on the doors of advanced genetics laboratories, demanding that science invent a way to bypass the state's lies.
And their relentless lobbying actually pushed the scientific community to innovate. The collaboration between the grandmothers and geneticists directly resulted in the creation of the National DNA Bank in Argentina,
The very first of its kind in the world.
designed specifically to identify stolen children and victims of state terror. They basically forced a new application of genetic science into existence.
And the results of that scientific leap are undeniable.
Over the decades, utilizing this DNA bank, over 130 children who grew up as adults believing a fabricated reality have been positively identified and reconnected with their biological families.
Over 130 human beings, pulled right out of the void of the state's lies.
And you really have to consider how this scientific backing made their movement completely bulletproof against state denial.
Before the DNA bank, the military and their loyalists could just hide behind the wall of state denial.
They could look at a grieving grandmother, dismiss her as hysterical or crazy, and wave a forged birth certificate in the air as their proof.
But DNA is entirely immune to state propaganda.
Precisely.
You are listening to Ayeneh podcast.
You can bribe a doctor. You can forge a signature. But you cannot forge a human genome.
The genetic evidence provided an empirical foundation. It merged the raw emotion of a grandmother's love with the cold, undeniable facts of genetics.
The regime's bureaucratic shield was completely shattered.
Identifying the children was a massive victory, but it immediately opened up the next massive chasm in the story.
The pendulum of justice.
Right, you found the child. But what about the people who stole them? What about the generals who ordered the murders of the biological mothers?
The pursuit of the truth inevitably collides with the demand for accountability.
Which brings us to a very complex era. In 1983, the dictatorship finally falls. Argentina transitions back to a democratic government, electing President Raúl Alfonsín.
And in those early days, there was a huge surge of hope across the country.
Because the new democratic president actually took unprecedented action.
He did. Alfonsín ordered the prosecution of the top military commanders.
They brought generals like Jorge Rafael Videla, the architect of the dictatorship, and Emilio Massera to court for crimes against humanity.
For the first time, ordinary citizens were watching the untouchable dictators sit in a courtroom. People started wondering, is justice actually possible?
But the realities of a fragile, newly formed democracy are rarely that clean.
No, they aren't. The military generals had stepped down from absolute political rule, but the military apparatus itself, the soldiers, the weapons, the institutional power, was still entirely intact.
So as the trials progressed and lower-ranking officers began facing subpoenas, the military establishment pushed back violently.
They launched uprisings. They explicitly threatened a new coup if the prosecutions didn't stop.
They essentially held a gun to the head of the new democracy.
And the democracy, terrified of returning to the dark days of 1976, made a devastating compromise.
Let's talk about the concept of state-mandated amnesia here. Because these laws were essentially the architectural blueprints for forcing a country to forget.
They absolutely were. The due obedience law codified the defense that anyone below the absolute highest ranks of command was merely following orders.
So they couldn't be held legally responsible for torture or murder?
Exactly. And the full stop law placed a hard, immediate deadline on the initiation of any new prosecutions.
Together, these laws threw a blanket of total immunity over the vast majority of the perpetrators.
Meaning the torturers, the kidnappers, and the doctors, who literally handed the stolen babies over to military families, walked completely free.
They went back to their lives, they shopped at the same grocery stores and walked the same streets as the families they had decimated.
The government was officially declaring that the missing babies and the murdered mothers were just statistics.
Treating them as statistics rather than human beings. Forcing the public to just swallow the injustice in the name of moving on.
It's the ultimate betrayal. The state demands that the victims forget their own history to maintain the comfort of the oppressors.
But the grandmothers, who had already decided they belonged to the truth, refused to accept this legislated amnesia.
The laws passed, the killers walked free, but the women kept marching. Every Thursday.
Through the late 80s, through the 90s, they maintained their silent vigil in the plaza.
Their stubborn presence ensured that the wound never comfortably closed for the state.
And their persistence really paid off when the political winds finally shifted.
Right. We move into the 2000s, which marks a massive reawakening of justice.
This is the era defined by the arrival of Nestor Kirchner and later Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner.
President Nestor Kirchner articulated a crucial philosophical reversal regarding the country's trauma.
I love this declaration he made in 2003. He stated, "We pursue justice not as the past, but as a necessary future."
It's brilliant, because the entire premise of the amnesty laws was that digging up the past would destroy the country's future stability.
He flipped that argument entirely. He posited that a society cannot actually build a stable, functioning future if its foundation is resting on buried atrocities.
The truth is a prerequisite for a healthy society. And by 2005, the Supreme Court of Argentina took the monumental step of declaring both the full stop and due obedience laws fundamentally unconstitutional.
The shield of immunity was instantly vaporized, the investigative files were suddenly ripped open again.
And the reopening of these cases triggered a wave of landmark convictions that finally validated decades of marching.
Let's detail some of those massive legal victories. In 2010, the former dictator Jorge Videla was sentenced to life in prison.
And the specific charge is vital here. He wasn't just convicted of broad political repression.
He was specifically convicted for his role in orchestrating the systematic theft of babies.
They successfully proved that the baby stealing was a top-down policy.
And the convictions reached the operational level, too. In 2011, the courts convicted Dr. Jorge Mañaco.
This was the medical professional who actively oversaw the clandestine maternity wards, the man who managed the forced births.
Reynaldo Bignon, another key figure, was also sentenced. And the judiciary explicitly categorized his crimes as actions aimed at erasing human identity.
That judicial categorization really culminated in a profound ruling by the Supreme Court in 2012.
Yes, the court determined that the systematic stealing of children by the military state was not just kidnapping.
It constituted cultural genocide.
By classifying the theft of identity as cultural genocide, it became legally exempt from any statute of limitations.
The legal clock can never run out on what they did.
Now, we can talk about the Supreme Court rulings and the broad strokes of history all day, but to truly grasp the weight of this era, you have to zoom in.
You have to step inside those courtrooms.
The historical record preserves the specific testimonies of the people involved, and these voices are what actually bent the arc of history.
The legal victories were built entirely on the backs of devastating personal testimonies.
Let's examine how the grandmothers wielded their evidence in court, starting with what we can call the grandmother's forensic proof.
This centers on the story of Alicia de la Cuadra.
Her pregnant daughter, Susanna, was abducted by the military, and for 15 years, Alicia searched every conceivable avenue.
Finally, she managed to unearth a single, highly sensitive piece of paper, a forensic report generated inside the clandestine military hospital where her daughter was held.
Alicia brought this document into the courtroom and presented it to the judge.
The document was a clinical, bureaucratic record of a birth. It listed the infant's exact date of birth. It listed the newborn's precise weight and height.
It was a complete medical record of a new human life, except for one glaring omission.
The space designated for the baby's name was completely blank.
The logic Alicia used to explain this blank space to the judge is absolutely chilling.
She pointed to the paper and stated, if the baby was dead, they would have written it. If alive, why no name? Because they were going to give the name themselves.
It is a devastating piece of deductive reasoning.
It completely dismantled the defense. They couldn't claim the baby was stillborn. They couldn't claim the records were just lost.
That blank space proved premeditation. At the exact moment of birth, the state had already initiated the machinery to erase the child's identity.
The second layer of testimony moves from the grandmothers to the few mothers who actually survived the clandestine camps.
This is the testimony of a woman named Maria Victoria. She stood in court directly facing Dr. Jorge Mañaco,
the obstetrician of the death camps.
Maria Victoria recounted the horrifying reality of giving birth in captivity.
She testified that after she delivered her baby, she heard the infant cry. And in that fleeting moment, Dr. Mañaco leaned over her and delivered a single, terrifying sentence.
He told her, "Don't worry, your baby will go to a good family."
Immediately after speaking those words, he injected her with a sedative, rendering her unconscious.
She woke up without her child. For decades, she carried the echo of that doctor's voice.
When she was asked by the court why she was putting herself through the trauma of testifying after so many years had passed, her answer became a defining ethos of the entire movement.
She told the court, "Because truth does not age, even if mothers grow old."
Truth does not age. It is a profound philosophical stance against the passage of time.
The authoritarian regime banked on the assumption that time would erode the resistance.
They assumed the mothers would just age, succumb to exhaustion, and eventually fade into history.
But Maria Victoria articulated that the factual reality of what the state did is eternally present.
The crime doesn't diminish just because the calendar turns.
And the final perspective we have to explore is perhaps the most surreal and complex of all.
The voices of the stolen children themselves.
Decades after the dictatorship fell, the infants who were taken grew into adults.
Through the relentless work of the grandmothers and the DNA bank, young men and women began to discover that their entire existence was a manufactured lie.
Their names, their families, their birthdays, all lies.
The psychological earthquake of that realization is difficult to even fathom.
The historical record highlights the testimony of a young man named Santiago. For the first 25 years of his life, he believed his name was Javier.
He believed the people who raised him were his biological parents, completely unaware of the blood on their hands.
And then the genetic cross-referencing revealed the truth.
Santiago found himself standing in a courtroom, testifying against the very people who had raised him.
The people who were complicit in the murder of his actual parents.
He delivered a shattering piece of testimony. He told the court, "I have two births, one silent in the military hospital and one in the genetics lab."
He declared himself to be living proof of the state's crimes, testifying against the people who stole his truth.
When you look at the trajectory from 1976 to those courtroom moments, you see the ultimate triumph of the grandmother's strategy.
The state apparatus had spent years utilizing all its power to label these women as hysterical.
Calling them the crazy women of the plaza.
Yet it was their meticulous, stubborn pursuit of empirical truth and scientific innovation that ultimately provided the living proof needed to dismantle the perpetrator's immunity.
They became the unshakable official witnesses of history.
It is a profound story of transformation. A group of grieving women who had everything taken from them managed to outlast a military dictatorship, force a leap in genetic science, and rewrite the legal framework of a nation.
As we look at the legacy of the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the sheer scale of their achievement is almost difficult to fully process.
Their legacy is a testament to the monumental power of nonviolent, persistent presence.
They never picked up a weapon. With just a peaceful weekly presence, they bent the arc of history toward accountability.
And that impact reverberates far beyond the borders of Argentina today.
The history of the Dirty War and the resistance of the abuelas is now part of the official curriculum in Argentine schools.
Their iconic white headscarves are preserved and displayed in human rights museums across the globe.
They have been officially recognized and awarded by the United Nations for their unprecedented pioneering work in the identification of disappeared children.
More broadly, they provided a viable blueprint for civil resistance against state violence. They demonstrated that ordinary citizens can effectively combat state-mandated amnesia.
Their methodology has inspired similar grassroots movements worldwide, like the Mothers of Independence Square in Turkey.
And various groups fighting for accountability for disappeared families in Chile and beyond.
And this brings us back to the core message that the Ayeneh Foundation sought to amplify by producing this historical video.
Right. The foundational lesson here is that individual, isolating loss, the kind of grief that is designed by an oppressor to destroy you, can actually be transmuted.
It can transform into a powerful, unyielding engine for collective memory and civic action. It's easy to feel like you, as an individual, lack the power or the resources to demand the truth.
But the text offers a powerful reminder. It says, if you don't just watch, if you stand, your glory becomes immortal in the void.
It is a sober recognition that justice is frequently delayed and often incomplete.
Many of the architects of the Dirty War died of old age before they could be brought to trial.
But whatever fragments of justice and truth we do achieve are forged entirely by those who stubbornly refuse to let the powerful bury the past.
Just remember the grandmothers. They started their fight against a heavily armed, murderous military regime with nothing but paralyzing grief and a piece of white cloth.
To leave you with a final thought to mull over today, we have spent the last hour examining how an entire state apparatus tried to legally mandate the forgetting of history.
And how a group of ordinary citizens used science and stubborn presence to ensure it was remembered.
It makes you wonder, in our own time of immense information overload, deep fakes, and shifting narratives, what essential truths are currently at risk of being quietly disappeared by those in power?
And who among us is standing in the plaza right now, holding the evidence, waiting for society to finally look?